A monster had dragged two people into the blackness beneath the world, and Kim Dokja was going after them. Down into a lightless pit where up and down lose all meaning, hunting a creature born of pure fear. But the deadliest thing waiting for him in the dark would not be the monster at all. It would be a betrayal, an obsession, and a truth about how ordinary people break when the world ends. After the beast seized Usanga and the nervous Myango Han and vanished into the tunnels, Kim Dokja moved quickly. He would go after them, and he would take only the boy Gilliang with him. It was a strange choice on the surface, taking a child into a monster's lair. But Gilliang's gift, his ability to speak with insects, was the perfect tool for tracking prey through the dark. Dokja asked Haiyan Xiang to stay behind and watch over Huiwan, who had not yet recovered. And then he descended into a place the ground rats called the Dark Fold, a pit so black that all light was swallowed whole, where it was impossible to tell which way was up or down. But Dokja carried a suspicion into the dark with him. One of Inho Chion's men had come along on this expedition, the spy sent to watch them. And Kim Dokja had seen something during the attack that he could not forget. "You let the monster go on purpose, didn't you?" he said. "When it took Sangha and that man away, I was watching you. You intentionally let it happen." The spy had allowed the creature to carry off two people, either to be rid of them or to serve some scheme of Inho's. It was a cold, human cruelty layered on top of the monstrous one, and the watching constellations were moved by it, some of them beginning to weep at the injustice, gifting Dokja coins in sympathy. Yet the descent was not only a rescue. As they moved deeper, the spy came to understand what Dokja was truly after. The monsters of the Dark Fold hoarded rare and precious treasures in their lairs, and the only way to reach that hoard was to follow the tunnels the creatures dug. "So you're after the items," the man realized. "Yes," Dokja admitted. "Are you disappointed?" "No," came the answer. Because Kim Dokja was doing two things at once, as he always did, saving the people he cared about while also seizing the opportunity the danger created. Kindness and calculation, tangled together as ever. And then, in the dark, the spy asked the questions that everyone eventually asked of Kim Dokja. "Are you a god?" he said quietly. "Or perhaps a protagonist?" And Dokja gave him the truth, or as much of it as he could. "I'm neither a god nor a protagonist," he said. "In fact, I've always been envious of protagonists. But I do know something about this world." The man pressed on, reaching for hope. "Then will we be granted a wish," he asked, "once we clear all the scenarios?" In stories like these, there's usually a reward waiting at the very end. It was the desperate hope of a drowning man. And Dokja understood it, because he understood how people survived a broken world. Those who adapted to the apocalypse all suffered through it in their own way. Some went mad. Some became fanatics. And some, against all reason, became irrationally, stubbornly optimistic. This frightened man, who had done a cowardly thing, was choosing in his own broken way to keep hoping, to keep living on in this new world. And Kim Dokja let him have that. They pressed deeper still, until at last a message bloomed in the black. They had entered the ground rat's treasure trove. "Dokja," the boy breathed, "this is." And the scratching began all around them in the dark, the sound of countless rats. Because treasure, Dokja knew, was not the only thing these creatures stored in their lair. The hoard was a kind of offering, a sacrifice the ground rats made to something far worse than themselves. But first, in the depths of that lair, they found the two they had come for. Usanga was alive. And so was Myango Han, though the well-dressed man was as unpleasant as ever, hurling blame at the woman beside him. "This is all your fault, Sangha," he snarled. "If you hadn't gotten on the subway that day, none of this would have happened to me. It was a bizarre, twisted accusation, and it exposed the small, ugly heart of him. Because the truth came spilling out. Manhwa had always been fixated on Sangha, and he was the one who had stolen her bicycle, the reason she'd been forced to take the subway on the very day the world ended. He had tampered with her life out of a creepy, entitled obsession, telling himself he only wanted to drive her home out of the goodness of his heart, furious that she kept rejecting him. He was not a monster with claws. He was something more pathetic and more human, a petty, self-deceiving man whose small cruelties had helped drag an innocent woman into the apocalypse. Even the constellations recoiled from him, the demonic judge of fire openly despising Manhwa for what he was. There was no time to reckon with him, though, because the true horror of the lair announced itself. The ground shook, and a monstrous presence rose out of the black. The system named it. The Warden of the Dark, a Tier 7 demonic species, a creature in a class far above the ordinary monsters they had faced. It was born of the black ether itself, so saturated with dark power that black flames manifested around it. It dwelt in the nucleus of something called a dark root, appearing wherever that corruption took hold. And it was no mindless beast. It spoke, in a strange and ancient tongue that Dokja could not understand, muttering words like a curse. Of all the monsters in this world, the demonic species were the most dangerous and the most unique. Even against a foe of equal level, they held the upper hand, and the treasures the ground rats hoarded were nothing more than sacrifices offered up to feed this thing. There was a reason the demonic species stood apart from every other monster in this world. An ordinary beast could be understood, its hunger predictable, its body mortal. But a demonic creature was something else, a thing warped by the raw corruption of the black ether until it became almost a small god of ruin. It did not simply kill. It unmade. And the treasures the ground rats piled up in the dark were not a hoard at all, but tribute, offerings laid at the feet of a monster the lesser creatures instinctively feared and worshipped. Dokja understood, standing there, that he had wandered into the den of something the entire ecosystem of the dark bowed down to. And the Warden of the Dark had a terrible gift. It had received the blessing of the Demon King itself, and from its body it spewed an overwhelming aura of pure fear, a dread so heavy it could freeze a person's heart and break their will before the fight even began. It should have paralyzed Dokja completely. But it did not. Because once again, the strange skill within him rose to meet the threat. The fourth wall, the system reported, had nullified most of the effects of the fear. Where anyone else would have crumbled, Dokja stood firm, shielded by the mysterious barrier that separated him from the emotions this world tried to force upon him. It was, perhaps, the gift of a reader who had always watched horror from a safe distance. Now that distance was keeping him alive. But the battle exacted its price. The monster's assault tore through the swarm of insects Gilliang had been controlling, and when they were destroyed, the psychic backlash struck the boy hard. All the creatures connected to his mind exploded at once, and Gilliang reeled from the considerable mental damage. "Ugh, Dokja," the boy gasped, swaying. "It's okay," Dokja told him gently. "Go ahead and rest." "How many more times," he asked, "can you use your communication skill?" "Maybe once or twice more," Gilliang admitted, exhausted. "All right," Dokja said. "Rest here for a while, then." He would not spend the boy's strength carelessly. Every ally was precious, and children most of all. And so Dokja faced the Warden of the Dark. He struck at it, and immediately understood the gulf between this creature and everything he had fought before. He managed only to cut the stem, and already his blade had gone blunt against its dark flesh. So this, he thought grimly, is the power of a demonic species. This was not a ground rat or a poisoned rabbit. This was a creature blessed by a demon king, wrapped in black flame and fear, muttering in a language older than the world. The warden reeled and roared, crying out in its strange tongue, and the whole lair shook with the force of the clash. Crash after crash, the reader and the demon tore at each other in the lightless dark. It was the hardest fight of his life so far, and Kim Dokja knew it. He had climbed a long way from the ordinary office worker who once read about all of this from the safety of his phone. He had killed a sea commander, outsmarted gods and tyrants, and gathered a small band of survivors around him. But now he stood in the belly of the dark against a thing that fed on terror, protected only by a wall he did not fully understand, with a wounded boy at his back and the people he'd come to save trembling behind him. The demonic species were a different order of danger entirely, and this was only the first of them he would face. But he did not run, and he did not break. Because that had never been his way. The loneliest reader in the world set his feet in the darkness of the ground rat's treasure trove, raised his blunted blade against the warden of the dark, and prepared to do what he always did, turn his impossible knowledge into a weapon, and carve a path forward that no one else could see. The demon's aura of fear washed over him and found nothing to grip. And in the black heart of the monster's lair, the battle for the lives of his companions, and for the treasure that might keep them all alive another day, raged on. His story, as always, was only just beginning. Kim Dokja stood against a demon that fed on fear, armed with a broken sword and no combat training at all. By every measure, he should have died in that dark lair. But he was about to win the only way he ever could. Not by fighting like a warrior, but by fighting like a reader. Because when you have read a monster's every move 1,000 times, you do not need to be stronger than it. You only need to remember. The Warden of the Dark roared in its strange, ancient tongue, and at first its words were only noise. But then Usanga did something remarkable. She had a hidden gift of her own, a skill called interpretation, and it was powerful enough that she could understand not only human languages but even the speech of the demonic species. As the monster snarled and muttered, she began, haltingly, to translate. And what she uncovered turned Dokja's blood cold. The creature kept saying one word over and over. Mother. It was not a plea. It was a purpose. The demonic species, Dokja knew, reproduced in a monstrous way, implanting their offspring into other living creatures and using them as hosts, as unwilling mothers to carry their young. That was what the Warden wanted from them. That was what it was already trying to do to Myango-han. The horror of it was almost worse than the danger. This thing did not simply want to kill them. It wanted to use their bodies as a nest. Get back, Sangha, Dokja warned, as the full meaning became clear. They were not prey to be eaten. They were vessels to be filled. He threw himself at the creature, but his weapon shattered against its dark flesh almost at once. Damn it, he thought. It broke. He had no real chance of beating this thing in a straight fight, and he had known that from the start. The Warden of the Dark was not like the sea serpent he had slain. It had not been placed here as a beatable challenge. But Kim Dokja always had a plan B. His original scheme had been simpler and safer, grab the treasure and slip away after the Warden left. Now that the fight had come to him anyway, he reached for the one advantage he had been quietly preparing all along. Back when he'd slain the ichthyosaur, Kim Dokja had claimed its rare nucleus, and he had listed it on the Dakibi auction house with a single, specific demand. He would trade it for one item and one item only, a weapon called Broken Faith. And now, in the middle of the battle, that trade completed. An item arrived from the auction house, and thanks to his contract with Bai Hyong, he was even exempt from paying the usual commission. Into his hands came Broken Faith, and the monster nearly laughed at the sight of it. Because broken faith was exactly what its name promised. A worn, shattered, low-grade blade, so damaged the system itself warned it was too degraded to be effective. Can you even fight with something like that? The demon sneered. But Kim Dokja had not bought a broken sword by mistake. He knew precisely what it was, and precisely what it could become. Because after hunting the ichthyosaur, he had used his coins to purchase a very particular skill from Bai Hyang, a skill called White Star Weapon Aura. And now he activated it. Broken faith reacted to his magic power, and the shattered blade blazed to life, wrapped in a brilliant white aura. The system named its new form the Blade of Faith. In an instant, the useless scrap of metal had become the single most effective weapon in existence against a demonic species. The monster's mockery died in its throat. And here Kim Dokja spoke the truth that was the heart of everything. Having a powerful sword, he thought, does not make me an excellent swordsman. But that was fine. Because I'm not a swordsman. I'm a reader. He could not outfence a demon. He had never held a real blade before the world ended. But he did not need the skill of a warrior. He had something no warrior possessed. He layered on more of his hidden power, activating his bookmark skill and calling up his second bookmark, drawing on the combat instincts of the soldier Hien Xiang Li. The borrowed skills came only partially, because his mastery was still low and his understanding of the man incomplete, and they drained his mana fast. But they were enough. A reader, he told himself, should fight like a reader. And then he showed the demon exactly what that meant. Because Kim Dokja had read about this creature. He had studied its kind across 3,000 episodes, and he knew its attack patterns the way he knew the plot of his favorite chapter. As the Warden lashed out, he narrated its every move before it happened. Its head telegraphed its strikes, easy to read once you knew the rhythm. It attacked the left with its upper tentacles first. Then it struck from the other side. And after it attacked twice, it always, without fail, paused for a single brief moment, an opening as wide as a doorway to a man who saw it coming. Kim Dokja did not dodge because he was fast. He dodged because he already knew where the blow would land. He did not strike because he was strong. He struck into the gap the story had told him would appear. Slash after slash, the reader danced through the demon's assault, slipping past tentacles that should have crushed him, driving the blade of faith into every opening. Sangha, using her interpretation skill, could hear the monster's growing panic, and she translated its disbelief aloud. How, the Warden of the Dark demanded, could you possibly know where I would attack? It was the same question the Regressor had asked, the same question everyone eventually asked of Kim Dokja. And to it, he gave the only answer that was ever true. You just, he said, have to read a lot. That was the whole secret, laid bare. He was not a chosen hero. He had no legendary bloodline, no monstrous strength, no divine sponsor whispering in his ear. He had a decade of obsessive, lonely reading, and a mind that remembered every page. And there was a strange poetry in it. For 10 years, reading this story had been the loneliest thing in his life, a solitary obsession no one else understood or shared, a habit he was almost ashamed of. It had cost him friends, cost him a normal life, cost him the ability to connect with the world around him. And now, that very same loneliness, that endless solitary reading, was the only thing keeping him and everyone he cared about alive. The thing that had once isolated him had become the thing that saved him. Where others saw a terrifying, unknowable demon, Kim Dokja saw a character whose every habit and weakness had already been written down for him. The apocalypse was a story, and he had finished it long before anyone else even knew it had begun. In a world where knowledge was the only true power, the man who had read the whole book could not lose to a creature that had never known it was being watched. The blade of faith carved into the warden again and again, its white aura tearing through the black flames that wreathed the monster's body. The creature that had spewed an aura of fear now found itself facing something it could not frighten and could not predict, a man who read its soul like text on a page. Its confidence crumbled. Its attacks grew wild and desperate. And with each pass, Kim Dokja pressed the advantage his impossible knowledge gave him, wearing down a demon that should have been far beyond his reach. It was, in its way, the purest expression of who Kim Dokja was. Every other survivor in this world fought with whatever the apocalypse had given them, raw strength, borrowed power, the favor of the gods. But Kim Dokja fought with the one thing that was entirely his own. He fought with the story. He turned a broken sword into a demon slayer, a decade of trivia into tactics, and a monster's own predictability into its undoing. He was proving, blow by blow, that a reader who truly understood the world could stand against horrors that outmatched him in every other way. And as the battle turned in his favor, something else became clear. The people he had come to save were watching, and they were beginning to understand what kind of man had walked into the dark for them. Sangha, translating the demon's fear, saw the reader move like he already knew the ending. Giliang, weak and recovering, saw his strange protector hold the line. Even the wretched Myeongo-han was still breathing because Kim Dokja refused to leave anyone behind, no matter how little they deserved it. This was the shape of his hypocrisy, the good he did while insisting he had reasons, and it was carrying them all through a nightmare. The Warden of the Dark shrieked and thrashed, its dark power guttering against the relentless white blade. It had ruled this lair as a small god, worshipped by lesser monsters, blessed by a demon king, wrapped in fear that broke the will of anyone who faced it. But it had never faced a reader. And the loneliest reader in the world drove forward through the black flames, blade of faith blazing in his hand, reading every desperate move before it came, closing in on a demon that had finally met the one opponent it could never understand. His story, as always, was only just beginning. And in the dark heart of the lair, against all odds, the reader was winning. Kim Dokja had just slain a demon that fed on fear. But the real masterstroke came after the battle, when the reader turned a deadly curse into an act of justice, and a pile of broken junk into a legendary weapon. Because in this world, winning the fight was only half the game. The other half was knowing exactly what to do with the spoils. With the blade of faith, Kim Dokja brought the Warden of the Dark to its knees, and the watching constellations could scarcely believe their eyes. The abyssal black flame dragon widened its gaze in shock. Others doubted what they were seeing. An ordinary man had wounded a Tier 7 demonic species with what looked like a broken sword. But the blade had done its work, and now, its magic spent, broken faith crumbled away, its durability gone for good. The weapon was finished. The monster, however, was not quite dead. And what Kim Dokja did next was pure, cold calculation. He did not deliver the final blow himself. Instead, he arranged for Myeongo-han to strike the killing stroke. On the surface, he made it sound almost noble. "I don't believe in killing carelessly," he said. And then, to himself, he added the truth. "I'm lying, of course." Because Kim Dokja knew a secret about demonic creatures. They were connected, through the dark root, to the demon king itself, carrying a fragment of its power. And whoever landed the final blow on such a monster would become the target of the demon king's hatred, cursed by the god of wrath and lust to have their greatest nightmare made real. By letting Myeongo-han take the kill, Kim Dokja passed that terrible curse directly onto the shoulders of the creepy, cruel man who had helped drag Sangha into the apocalypse. It was revenge dressed as generosity, punishment disguised as a gift. The system logged them both as contributors and rewarded the impossible feat with 8,000 coins, and Kim Dokja became the first person ever to slay a Tier 7 demonic species. The secretive plotter, delighted by the sheer ruthless cunning of it, was so impressed by his evil scheme that it recommended his channel across the entire star stream. With the Warden dead, it was time to claim the treasure. But the hoard was smaller than Dokja had hoped. A mana recovery bracelet, a rusty iron shield, minor things. It was not as rich as he'd expected, and he knew why. The true protagonist, Yu Junghyuk, had passed through this area the day before and already taken the best of it. Even so, there was one item that mattered more than all the rest, a key piece for the current scenario, the mana brazier. Kim Dokja recognized it instantly, because he had read about exactly what it could do. And there was food. The party was starving, and the monster's carcass provided meat. They cooked a ground rat leg over a fire, and though the survivors hesitated, Kim Dokja knew from the story which monsters were safe to eat and how to prepare them. They ate, ravenous, and even the watching constellations smacked their lips at the sight. "How do you know all this?" someone marveled. "You even know how to cook a monster we've never seen." "It's because you've read a lot of fantasy novels, isn't it?" Dokja let them believe it. It was close enough to the truth. And when Sangha used her language gift to help make sense of strange writings they found, he thanked her honestly. In this broken world, every one of them was starting to find their own quiet strength. But the real prize of the lair was something the others almost overlooked. A plain, strange box covered in writing that only Sangha could begin to read. A random item box. Kim Dokja's eyes lit up, because he knew precisely what this was. In the story, the very first person to ever discover one of these had been a legendary figure called the Flying Fox. Even Yu Junghyuk, who had taken the other mana brazier, had never known the real treasure of this lair was this humble box. Because it was no ordinary container. It was a recalled premium item, so powerful and so unbalancing that the Star Stream's own management center had pulled it from circulation. Its function was simple and absurd: place low-grade items inside, close the lid, and it would spit out a high-grade item, guaranteed. An engine that turned trash into treasure. Anything that could reliably upgrade junk into power was a threat to the balance of the entire game, which was exactly why it had been banned. Kim Dokja did not hesitate. He fed the box the rare core of the Tier 7 demon he had just slain, along with the remnants of broken faith, and closed the lid. The system stirred to life. Random loot had been activated. And because the items he'd placed inside were tied to a specific constellation, the odds shifted dramatically, greatly increasing the chance that whatever emerged would be connected to that same powerful being. Give me something, he thought, higher than an A grade. He got far more than that. A high-grade item emerged in a flash of light. And when they opened it, what lay inside stole the breath from everyone present. A magnificent sword, radiant and whole. The system named it, Unbreakable Faith. Its grade was not a mere letter. It was classified as a constellation artifact, a tier of item that towered far above the ordinary alphabetical grades, a weapon that belonged to the gods themselves. Even Myongo Han could tell it was extraordinary. "Is this for real?" someone gasped. "A constellation artifact. It's way above anything we've seen." Kim Dokja had walked into that lair with a broken piece of scrap, and he was walking out with a legendary, unbreakable blade, the perfect evolution of the demon-slaying weapon he had lost. And there was more. The moment he obtained it, a message told him that the artifact's original owner, a constellation of real power, had become curious about the man who now wielded it. He had not just gained a weapon. He had drawn the attention of a god. This was the genius of Kim Dokja laid bare once again. He did not simply survive his battles. He mined them. Where another survivor would have grabbed the obvious loot and left, Kim Dokja saw the hidden value in a plain box, the opportunity in a broken sword, the leverage in a curse. He turned a monster's death into a fortune, a piece of junk into a constellation artifact, and a cruel man's final blow into both justice and self-preservation. Every choice was 3 moves deep, every scrap of knowledge converted into power. He was not the strongest person in the apocalypse. But he was, without question, the one who wrung the most out of every single thing the apocalypse gave him. For a moment, it seemed the expedition had ended in triumph. They had slain a demon, claimed a legendary blade, secured the key mana brazier, and eaten their fill. All that remained was to head back to the station, and with Giliang's insects to guide them through the dark tunnels, the way home should have been simple. "Let's head back," Dokja said. They would take the mana brazier and return to the others. But then the wrongness settled over them. Giliang reached out for his insects, the tiny allies that had scouted every step of their journey, and found nothing. "There aren't any insects around," someone said uneasily. Had they all been destroyed in the battle with the Warden? Not even one. "To tell you the truth," the boy began, "there is one left, but it's—" And he never finished the sentence. Because something struck out of the darkness. A rush of movement, a heavy impact, and suddenly the ground trembled. "Dokja," Sangha cried, "something's wrong with Giliang." Giliang. A drop of something dark fell in the black, and the boy who talked to insects was in terrible danger. It was the cruelest kind of turn, the apocalypse snatching away a moment of victory. Kim Dokja had done everything right. He had won the battle, outsmarted the curse, and forged a legendary weapon. But the dark was not finished with them. Something had been waiting, something the insects could not warn them about, and now it had struck at the youngest and most vulnerable of them all. The loneliest reader in the world spun toward the sound, unbreakable faith gleaming in his hand, his heart lurching at the danger to the child he had sworn to protect. The treasure was won. But the price for it was about to come due. And his story, as always, was only just beginning. Kim Dokja returned from the dark a conqueror, carrying a legendary blade and the key to their survival. But the danger waiting for him back at the station was worse than any monster. It was a mob of desperate, frightened people, whipped into a frenzy by a smiling tyrant, and every one of them wanted his coins, or his blood. This was the reader's darkest test yet. Not a battle of strength, but a trial of judgment. The journey home began with terror. As they tried to leave the lair, young Giliang reached out with his insect-speaking gift and accidentally summoned something monstrous, a monarch species insect, a towering creature that nearly buried them all alive. "Snap out of it, Giliang," they shouted, dragging him back before the giant thing could crush them. He had reached too far into the dark and pulled up a nightmare. Afterward, Kim Dokja laid down a firm rule. "Don't use that skill again," he told the boy gently but seriously, "not until I say so." Some powers were too dangerous to use carelessly, and a child's gift could just as easily become a curse. But they still needed a way through the lightless tunnels, and it was Sangha who provided it. She revealed a skill of her own, a thread that could guide them out of any labyrinth, one she had cleverly anchored to a fixed point even while she was being dragged away as a captive. It was the thread of a survivor who kept her wits even in terror. And when Kim Dokja tried to read her character profile, curious about her growing power, the system gave him a message he had never seen before. She had no registered profile at all. Her secrets were sealed. He realized what it meant. Senga had signed a special pledge in her Star Stream contract, one that forbade her from revealing any information about herself, on pain of death. Some hidden, powerful constellation had taken an interest in her and was quietly training her in the shadows. And so Kim Dokja gave her the wisest advice he could. Never reveal your personal attribute to anyone, he warned her. In this world, a secret kept was a life preserved. When they finally emerged, an old friend was waiting. Bai Hyung, the Dakibi, had reopened his channel with a theatrical flourish. "Have you all been well while I was away?" it crowed, winking. Its discipline was over. And Dokja soon learned the full reason for it. The management center had punished Bai Hyung not only for abruptly cutting his broadcast, but because of the outrageous random item box that Dokja had found and used, a recalled premium item the Dakibi had greedily left lying around. "If I hadn't been so greedy back then," Bai Hyung muttered, eyeing Dokja's new haul with open envy. The little goblin could hardly believe a mere human knew about such things. "Is there anything I can use?" it asked slyly, eyeing the gleaming new sword. "No," said Dokja. "What about that blade?" "It's mine." The reader had returned richer, sharper, and more dangerous than ever. But none of it prepared him for what he found back at Gumho Station. The survival fee had reached its cruelest hour. Midnight was approaching, the moment when coins would be ripped from every account, and anyone who came up short would simply die. And the station had descended into desperate chaos. People clutched at Kim Dokja, begging. "Please, spare us some coins," one cried. "My child doesn't have enough." Others offered him the money of the dead world, worthless now. "I'll pay you 1,000,000, one pleaded. 10,000,000 won for 100 coins. But paper money meant nothing anymore. In this world, coins were life itself, and coins were power. And the man who had returned with the most of them was suddenly surrounded by the drowning, all reaching for the same lifeline. And Inho Cheon was ready for exactly this moment. This was the trap he had been building all along, and now he sprang it in front of the whole station. He stoked the crowd's desperation and turned it against Kim Dokja. "Do you know how many of you could survive," he asked the mob, "if you hadn't bought that food from him? He's the reason you're short. Give us our coins back," the people howled, their fear curdling into rage. "I want a refund. You've been squeezing us since the day you arrived." Inho had transformed Dokja, the man who had actually fed them, into the villain hoarding their survival. And then he laid the choice bare, publicly, cruelly. "I don't have enough coins to save all these poor people," Inho said, spreading his hands. "But you do. Are you just going to let them die?" 20 desperate faces turned toward Kim Dokja. "Share your coins and be bled dry by an endless tide of need, or keep them and be branded a murderer before the entire station." It was the hero or villain trap, sharpened to a killing edge. And the whole cosmos leaned in to watch. The prisoner of the golden headband waited for his decision. The demonic judge of fire waited. The secretive plotter waited. Every constellation held its breath to see what the reader would do when mercy and survival were placed on opposite sides of a scale. But Kim Dokja saw the situation with cold, clear eyes, and he understood something the mob refused to face. This was the theme of judgment. The very first scenario, the one every person in this station had cleared, had been built around original sin. Every single survivor here had taken another human life to earn their place. They were all murderers. And yet not one of them could take responsibility for it. They had killed to live, and now they wanted to blame the man with the coins for their hunger, to make Kim Dokja carry the weight of choices they had made themselves. They begged for salvation while refusing to look at their own hands. Their desperation was real, but so was their cowardice, and Dokja would not let their guilt become his burden. So he refused to play In-ho-cheon's game. "I'm not going to dance to his tune any longer," he decided. When In-ho pressed him, feigning innocence, asking why he should be the one to give, Kim Dokja turned the whole scheme back on its author. "Return the coins to these people," he said. Because it was In-ho-cheon, all along, who had extorted and hoarded and sent the weak out to die. It was In-ho who had drained them dry and then pointed the finger at the newcomer. Dokja was not the source of their suffering. The smiling man beside them was. And Kim Dokja, refusing the false choice, demanded the true villain make it right. It was a dangerous move, and Dokja knew it. Confronting In-ho in front of the mob would not calm them. It would ignite them. Things, he thought grimly, are about to get ugly very quickly. And they did. The crowd, too far gone in their fear and greed, too eager for someone to punish, turned their fury on him. "You prick," one screamed. "Give me back my coins." "Kill him," another shouted. "Let's kill him and take his coins." The desperation had become a lynch mob, and it surged toward Kim Dokja with murder in its eyes. "Die, bastard," a man roared, and lunged at him with a weapon raised. But Kim Dokja was no longer the frail office worker who had first stumbled onto that subway. He had slain a sea commander and a demon lord's warden. He carried an unbreakable constellation artifact and the borrowed strength of soldiers. And when the man attacked, the reader answered with cold, overwhelming force. In a single motion it was over, the attacker cut down before he could land a blow, a shocked cry echoing through the station as the mob recoiled in horror. The gap between Kim Dokja and these ordinary, panicking people had become a chasm. They had thought him a soft target, a hoarder they could bully and rob. They had been catastrophically wrong. "How pathetic," Dokja said quietly, standing over the fallen man as the crowd shrank back. "Do you really blame me for this?" It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a hard, honest question thrown at people who could not stop lying to themselves. They had murdered to survive and called it necessity. They had let In-ho-cheon rule them and called it order. They had begged for coins they had not earned and called Kim Dokja a villain for not simply handing them his life's work. And now, when one of them raised a blade, they learned exactly what it cost to mistake mercy for weakness. Kim Dokja had spent this entire arc being a hypocrite, doing good while insisting on his selfish reasons, feeding the hungry, saving the drowning. But he would not be a martyr. He would not let a mob of self-pitying killers tear him apart to suit their own guilt. And through it all, In-ho-cheon watched, his careful trap unraveling in real time. He had counted on Kim Dokja being cornered, forced to either bankrupt himself or be destroyed by the crowd. He had not counted on the reader simply refusing the entire premise, turning the judgment back on the guilty and answering violence with a force no one in that station could match. The time of judgment had come to Gumho Station. And it was not going to fall the way the tyrant had planned. The loneliest reader in the world stood alone against a terrified mob and a smiling manipulator, an unbreakable blade in his hand and a decade of hard truth in his eyes. His story, as always, was only just beginning. And the reckoning had only started. A mob wanted Kim Dokja dead, a tyrant had turned an entire station against him, and midnight was minutes away. But the reader was not going to save these people by fighting for them. He was going to do something far more dangerous. He was going to hand them a terrible truth, and make them save themselves. This was the time of judgment, and the reckoning was about to fall on the guilty. Kim Dokja stood over the gangster who had attacked him, cut down in a single motion, and looked at the terrified crowd. He read the fallen man's profile, an ordinary thug, yet with combat stats far higher than any common criminal should have. Someone had made him strong. And Dokja began to pull the truth out into the open. "You're only doing this," he told the frightened people, "because you're scared of them. You know something is wrong. You know your lives are at stake. But the gangsters are stronger than you, with more coins and higher stats, and so you obey." Then he asked the question that would unravel everything. "But why," he said, "do they have more coins and higher stats than you? Because they're gangsters?" No. He laid it out with cold, merciless logic. "When I arrived here just days ago," he said, "there were 87 people in this station. Now there are barely 50. Where did the others go?" "Monsters," someone stammered. "They died on patrol, in the search parties." "Do you still believe that?" Dokja asked. "Then why has no one in the gang ever died? Why do they always come back stronger than before?" And here was the blade of it, the truth hiding in plain sight. Just moments ago, in their rage, the mob had shouted that they would receive coins for killing Kim Dokja. "So how," he asked quietly, "did you know that? How did you all know that killing a person earns you coins? Who taught you that?" The answer was monstrous. The gangsters, Inho Cheon's men, had not lost the missing 37 to monsters. They had murdered them. They had taken the weak, the ones sent out on the deadly search parties, and slaughtered them for their coins, leveling up their own stats on the corpses of the helpless, then returning to lie that the creatures of the surface had done it. The vanished survivors had not been eaten by the apocalypse. They had been killed by the men who ruled them. And the architect of it all, the smiling hand behind every murder, was Inho Cheon. "Inho," Dokja said, turning to him. "Did you do this?" "Shut up," the tyrant snarled, his mask finally cracking. "It's a lie." But the constellations knew the truth. The secretive plotter nodded along with Dokja's reasoning. The prisoner of the golden headband was beside himself with excitement. And the constellations of the pure good alignment rendered their verdict, formally deeming Inho Cheon an evildoer. The mask was off. The kindly leader who redistributed food and asked everyone to work together had been feeding the weak to his wolves the entire time, and every person in that station suddenly understood that they were nothing but livestock, waiting their turn to be slaughtered for coins. And this was Kim Dokja's true masterstroke. He did not draw his sword and cut down the gangsters himself. He could have. He was strong enough now to end them all in minutes. But he knew that would solve nothing. If he simply killed the wolves, the sheep would remain sheep, and the next tyrant would rise the moment he left. A people saved by someone else never truly become free. They only trade one master for another, waiting helplessly for the next hero, or the next monster, to decide their fate. Kim Dokja had seen it happen 100 times in the pages of the story. And so he chose the harder path, the one that would actually last. Instead of fighting for them, he turned to the terrified, oppressed majority and gave them back their courage. "If you have even an ounce of pride left inside you," he told them, "then fight them yourselves. Take back what was stolen from you, with your own hands." It was not enough to be rescued. These people had spent this whole nightmare kneeling, obeying, letting the strong prey on the weak while they looked away. If they wanted to live as human beings and not as cattle, they had to stand up on their own. Dokja handed them the truth, and the truth set them on fire. The station erupted. The frightened majority, realizing they were next in line to die, finally rose against their tormentors. "He's right," someone roared through his tears. "You murdered them." And the uprising began, a desperate, furious tide of ordinary people turning on the gangsters who had bled them dry. It was ugly and chaotic and violent, neighbors who had shared food moments ago now fighting for their lives. But it was theirs. For the first time, they were not waiting to be saved. They were saving themselves. And in the heart of that uprising, something extraordinary happened. Hui Wen-jong, the quiet woman Kim Dokja had rescued from the poison fog, faced the man who had once tried to assault her. "I told you," she said coldly, "that I was going to get you." And she struck him down. In that moment of righteous vengeance, the requirement she had been building toward all along was finally met. Her hidden attribute, the humble crouching figure that Dokja had recognized as a seed of legendary potential, blossomed at last. It evolved, transforming into something rare and powerful, Judge of Evil, a heroic great attribute, the most formidable of the three great judges in the entire story. The broken, underestimated woman had become a weapon of pure justice. And Kim Dokja had contributed to it, the system noted, his faith in her helping her potential bloom. Hui Wen activated her new power, a skill called Time of Judgment, and the constellations of the pure good alignment roared their approval. She became an executioner of the wicked, moving through the gangsters like a scythe through wheat. Where the ordinary survivors struggled against their stronger oppressors, Hui Wen did not hesitate. Blow after blow, she cut down the evildoers who had murdered the weak, a judge delivering a sentence long overdue. "Step back for a moment, Dokja," she told him. This was her judgment to carry out. And she would not hesitate to fight for the man who had believed in her when no one else would. The tables turned completely. What had been a mob howling for Kim Dokja's blood became an uprising that swept away Inho Cheon and his entire regime. The gangsters who had ruled through fear and murder found the fear turned back on them, and the Judge of Evil descending upon them without mercy. It was almost hard to believe, one survivor thought, that they had all been sharing food and joking together just moments before. But that was the truth of this world. The thin skin of civilization had peeled away, and underneath it lay both the capacity for monstrous cruelty and, in the right moment, the capacity to rise up and fight for one's own life. Inho Cheon's careful empire of despair, built on the bodies of the people he was supposed to protect, collapsed in a single violent night. The tyrant who fed on hopelessness was finally consumed by the very people he had starved. And through it all, the constellations watching the channel were in ecstasy, drinking in the spectacle of judgment falling on the guilty. Kim Dokja had given them the greatest show yet, not by being the strongest, but by being the one who saw the truth and had the nerve to speak it, the one who refused to let a comfortable lie stand, the one who trusted the broken and the weak to find their own strength when it mattered most. Then midnight came, and the survival fee was collected. Coins were torn from every account, and those who could not pay were gone. The cruel machinery of the apocalypse ground on, indifferent to the drama that had just played out. But something fundamental had changed in Gumho Station. The murderers no longer ruled. The weak had learned they could stand. And a new judge walked among them, forged in that night of reckoning. In the aftermath, amid the blood and the exhaustion, Kim Dokja reached down to help someone to their feet. "Get up," he said. "The scenario has only just begun." Because this was the truth he never let anyone forget. Survival was not a single victory. It was a road with no end in sight, one trial after another, each one demanding everything they had. They had cleared the horror of Gumho Station, exposed a monster in human skin, and awakened a hero in a woman the world had thrown away. But the second main scenario still stretched out ahead of them, and the next area was already calling, the ruined district of Yaksu, where the true protagonist had gone before them. The system confirmed it. They had entered the second scenario area, and it was time to move on to the place where the next trial waited. The time of judgment had passed, and it had fallen exactly where it should, on the guilty rather than the desperate. Kim Dokja had walked into a den of frightened murderers ruled by a smiling tyrant, and he was walking out having toppled that tyrant, freed the oppressed, and forged an ally with the power of a judge. He had done it all not with the strength of a hero, but with the truth of a reader who saw what everyone else refused to see. And as the survivors gathered themselves and turned toward the road ahead, the loneliest reader in the world pressed forward into the dark. His story, as always, was only just beginning. With one nightmare behind him, Kim Dokja walked into the poison fog on a pilgrimage. Not to pray, but to rob a god. Because the loneliest reader in the world knew a secret shortcut that could turn a shattered statue into a divine weapon, if he had the nerve to commit a kind of blasphemy that made even the constellations gasp. The dust settled over Gumho Station, and it was time to move on. The tyrant was gone, the murderers overthrown, and the survivors who remained went their separate ways. But Kim Dokja's group had grown. Hui Wen-jong, newly awakened as the judge of evil, walked with them now, an ally forged in the night of reckoning. Only Myongo Han had vanished, slipping away without a trace, carrying the Demon King's curse. Dokja had passed on to him into the dark. And before they left, Kim Dokja did something that surprised his companions. He divided up the coins he'd earned and gave everyone their share. "What's this for?" they asked. "It's your share," he said simply. "I'd feel bad keeping it all." Hyen Xiang shook his head. "I wouldn't have done that," he admitted. "But I'm not you, Dokja." And that difference, that stubborn generosity, was exactly what drew people, and gods, to Kim Dokja's side. He spent the rest of his fortune on himself, too, but wisely, pouring over 4,000 coins into his core stats, raising his stamina, strength, agility, and mana, keeping enough mana in reserve to fuel his White Star weapon aura. He was no longer just clever. He was becoming genuinely powerful. And he had a plan to grow richer still, by raising the level of Bai Hyong's channel and drawing in ever more watching constellations. Their next destination, he knew, would be the perfect stage for exactly that. That destination came with a new command from the system. The second main scenario had activated. It was called the Encounter, and its condition was clear: travel through the tunnels and meet with the survivor of the first shelter zone. That shelter zone had a name. Chungmuro Station. So the group set out through the underground, from Yaksu toward Chungmuro, 3 stations away, expecting an easy journey. It was anything but. The tunnels were infested with ground rats and shambling dead, and they had to fight for every step. But it was the corpses that troubled Kim Dokja most. Looking at their wounds, he could tell at a glance that these people had not been killed by monsters. They had been cut down by a blade, precise and merciless. This, he knew, was almost certainly the work of Yu Junghyuk. The true protagonist had passed this way before them, carving a path through anyone who stood between him and his goal. It was a grim reminder, written in blood along the tunnel walls, that in this world the monsters were not the only things to fear. Sometimes the most dangerous predator wore a human face. When they reached the ruins near Dongguk University, Kim Dokja insisted they stop and rest. But he had an ulterior motive, as he always did. Slipping away from the others, he ventured out of the station and into the open air, straight into the poisonous fog that hung over the dead city. His companions were baffled. Why would he go out there? He said, someone offered uncertainly, that he was going on a pilgrimage. A pilgrimage. It made no sense to them. But Kim Dokja knew exactly what he was looking for, because he had read about it. And after a short search through the haze, he found it. A statue. The stone likeness of a revered figure called the great monk Samyang. And then Kim Dokja did the unthinkable. He destroyed it. He shattered the sacred statue, and the reaction was immediate and furious. A constellation wearing a robe was stunned by what he had done. His companions were horrified. "Are you insane?" they cried. "Do you know what you just did? You've destroyed the idol of a constellation." But this was no act of madness. It was a calculated shortcut straight out of the pages of the story. In this world, idols and statues were sealed with the power of the constellations they represented. And when that seal was broken, the one who broke it could claim skills and items belonging to that very constellation. Kim Dokja needed the great monk's power to enter Chungnyeoro safely, and rather than spend precious time breaking the seal through proper, respectful means, he simply smashed it open. It was brazen, disrespectful, and exactly the kind of shameless gambit that had carried him this far. Here, Sanga's quiet gift proved its worth again. She knew this history. She explained that the great monk Samyang was no mere legend but a real hero of Korea's past, a warrior monk of the mid-Joseon dynasty who had risen to defend his country during a foreign invasion, winning famous battles when his people needed him most. Her knowledge shone even in the middle of the apocalypse, and the robed constellation was visibly touched to hear its true self remembered and honored by this thoughtful young woman. Where Dokja's blasphemy had angered the god, Sanga's respect began to soften it. And from the broken statue, the treasures came. The robe of the great monk Samyang, a B-grade item that strengthened a person's sense of justice and will. The praying beads of the great monk Samyang, which enhanced the recovery of mana. Powerful relics, imbued with the monk's holy strength, falling from the sky like a blessing. "I offered a prayer at his statue," Dokja said with feigned humility, "and these gifts came down to me." But Kim Dokja was not finished. Because he understood the deepest truth about the constellations, their power and their wealth flowed directly from their fame. A god remembered and praised grew stronger. A god forgotten faded away. And so Dokja, who had just smashed the being's idol to pieces, now turned around and flattered it shamelessly. "I believe," he declared, "that the great monk Samyang has sent these relics down to us for the future of our country. Just as he protected Korea during the invasion long ago, he is surely helping us defend it again now, in this new invasion of monsters. Come on," he thought, "take the bait." And the constellation did. No god, however slighted, could resist the chance to have its name praised and its legend honored. The robed being, this bald leader of the peasants' army, was so moved by Dokja's words that it not only forgave his blasphemy but revealed its own nickname and gifted him 100 coins. Kim Dokja had destroyed a god statue and walked away with the god's treasures, the god's favor, and the god's money. It was audacity elevated to an art form. This was who Kim Dokja had become. He did not simply survive the apocalypse. He worked it like a machine with rules he alone understood. Where others saw a sacred statue to be revered, he saw a locked treasure chest. Where others saw an angry god to be feared, he saw an audience that could be flattered. He turned history into strategy through Sangha, blasphemy into profit through sheer nerve, and a god's wounded pride into a source of coins. Every scrap of his impossible knowledge, every reckless gamble, was bent toward a single goal, getting himself and the people around him one step closer to surviving what was coming. With the great monk's relics secured and the constellation appeased, the group pressed on toward Chungnyeoro. Thanks to Gilyong's insects scouting ahead, they avoided the worst of the ground rats and made steady progress. "We should get ready," Dokja told them. "We'll be in Chungnyeoro soon. Don't let your guard down." They had perhaps half a mile left before the station appeared, and Kim Dokja knew better than anyone that the closer they came to their destination, the more dangerous the road would become. And he was right. Just as the end of their journey drew near, the system stirred once more. A new sub-scenario had arrived. "Stand back, everyone," Dokja said, moving to the front of the group, his hand ready on the hilt of his unbreakable blade. Whatever waited for them at the threshold of Chungnyeoro Station, it was not going to let them pass quietly. The second main scenario, the encounter, was pulling them toward its climax, toward the survivor of the first shelter zone and whatever truth lay waiting there. The loneliest reader in the world stood at the edge of the next trial, richer, stronger, and better armed than ever before, but still walking into the unknown. His story, as always, was only just beginning. The deadliest trap in the apocalypse was not a monster with teeth or claws. It was a prison built from your own worst memories, a place that reached into your mind and dragged you into your deepest trauma until it drove you insane. Even the Regressor feared it. But Kim Dokja was about to walk through it untouched, because of a blasphemy he had committed hours before, and a wall that no nightmare could breach. As the group neared Chungnyeoro, the system announced a new sub-scenario. The Illusory Prison. A whoosh of unnatural force swept over them, and suddenly they were falling into darkness, each of them sick and disoriented. "What's this?" someone cried. "I feel sick." And then the world dissolved into private nightmares. Because the Illusory Prison was no ordinary dungeon. It was a zone that triggered a person's deepest trauma and used it to drive them mad. It was, the story said, the single most dangerous obstacle a regressor could ever face. Even Yu Junghyuk, hardened by 3 lifetimes of horror, would have struggled here, trapped alone with the ghosts of everything that had ever broken him. But Kim Dokja did not fall. A message bloomed calmly in the dark. He had become immune to the effects of the Illusory Prison, thanks to his skill. The fourth wall, that strange barrier that separated him from the emotions the world tried to force on him, activated once more and simply refused the nightmare entry. Where everyone else was drowning in their own worst memories, Kim Dokja stood untouched, clear-eyed, and free. The gift of a reader who had always watched the story from the other side of the page had become his shield against madness itself. And now the reason for his earlier blasphemy became clear. Back at Dongguk University, he had shattered the statue of the great monk Samyang, an act that had horrified his companions and angered a god. But it had not been reckless at all. From the broken idol, he had claimed a specific skill, and that skill was called Dispel Evil. He had known this prison was coming. He had smashed a sacred statue precisely so that he would have the power to dismantle this exact trap when the moment arrived. "Please cover me for a bit," he told the one companion still standing beside him, "while I destroy this zone." And he activated Dispel Evil, and the skill began to tear the Illusory Prison apart from the inside. Every reckless gamble Kim Dokja made was really a move planned pages in advance. But breaking the prison meant walking through the traumas of the people he cared about, and it was a harrowing thing to witness. Hyen Seong, the strong soldier, was trapped reliving his military past, snapping to attention and reciting the soldier's oath, then breaking down, apologizing to his mother, crying out that he had been too late to save someone. Hui Won, the newly awakened judge of evil, was consumed by her darkest impulse, her eyes turning red as a sign of demon slaying overtook her, murmuring that she would kill them all. And little Gilliang, it seemed, suffered the most traumatic vision of them all, a child's pain laid bare in the dark. Even Usanga was caught in something private and painful, and when Kim Dokja reached her, she asked him only one thing, that he pretend he had seen nothing. And he honored it. In a world that stripped everyone bare, he gave her the small mercy of her privacy. To pull them free, he used the very relics he had claimed from the shattered statue. The robe of the great monk Samyang, which strengthened a person's sense of justice and will, and the praying beads, which steadied the mind and restored mana. He moved through the nightmare like a man walking through a burning house, dismantling the illusion piece by piece with dispel evil, reaching each of his companions and dragging them back toward the light. The condition of the sub-scenario was fulfilled, and he received his reward of 300 coins. But he did not let his guard down, and he was right not to. Because the prison had makers. Out of the fading illusion emerged the creatures that had built it, a tier 8 ghost species called specters. Their attacks were psychic rather than physical, striking at the mind instead of the body, which was exactly why the illusion had been so potent. But with the prison broken and Kim Dokja free to fight, the specters were no longer the threat they had been. He and Sangha cut them down, and from their remains came a rare treasure, a specter spirit stone. The nightmare was over. One by one, his companions came back to themselves. Hien Xiang snapped awake, still half lost in his soldier's mind, then slowly returned. "How long was I out?" he asked, dazed. They explained what had happened, that monsters had trapped them in an illusion of their worst traumas, and that Kim Dokja had defeated them all. "Just you and Sangha," Hien Xiang marveled. "It was mostly Dokja," someone corrected. The soldier could hardly thank him enough. "I guess we're out of the woods now," he said. "It's nothing," Dokja replied. But Dokja's real concern was for the youngest of them. Giliang, gentle Giliang who talked to insects, had endured the most painful vision of all, and he was still trembling, apologizing to a mother who wasn't there, his small head aching. Kim Dokja knelt and pulled the boy into an embrace. In a world that had turned children into soldiers and survivors into murderers, the reader still made time to hold a frightened kid and tell him it was all right. It was a small thing. But it was the kind of small thing that made all the difference, and it was why these people followed him. "It looks like we've almost made it," someone said softly. They were nearly there. And then they reached the threshold of Chungmuro, and there, at the top of the stairs, someone was waiting for them. A lone figure blocking the way, a blade in hand. "Don't you know," she demanded, "that these hunting grounds belong to us? Who are you people?" Kim Dokja looked up, and recognition washed over him. Because he knew exactly who this was. A teenage girl, 17 years old, the sole survivor of a place called Taepung Girls' High School. Her name was Jai Li. And she was no ordinary survivor. She was one of the main characters of the entire story. Jai Li was a crucial figure, and her arrival here was the whole point of the second main scenario, the encounter. Her supporting constellation was one of the most legendary of all, the god of naval warfare, the spirit of a great admiral who had once saved his nation on the sea. Even in the apocalypse, that bond had not changed from the story Dokja remembered. She was the reason Yu Jonghyuk had rushed straight to Chungmuro ahead of everyone else, because she was essential to a great naval battle that loomed somewhere on the road ahead. To have defeated the specters and arrived here, she noted, was something only a true master should have been able to do. She was measuring them, wondering what kind of people had survived what should have killed them. And here, at last, Kim Dokja's earlier gamble paid off in full. Because he had flattered the constellation of the great monk Samyang, praised its legend and honored its name, that god now walked with him in spirit. And when it recognized the constellation standing behind young Jai Li, the god of naval warfare, the two ancient heroes greeted each other like old friends reunited after a long age. The bald leader of the peasants' army was moved to find a comrade, and Jihai's own constellation happily returned the greeting. Two legendary defenders of the same country, meeting again through their incarnations in a ruined world. Kim Dokja's shameless praise of a broken statue had, it turned out, laid the groundwork for this very moment, softening the path to an alliance with one of the story's most important characters. Whatever tension there had been at the top of those stairs eased. Jihai Li, recognizing that these were not enemies, lowered her guard. "Follow me," she said. "I'll take you to the station." And with that, the system delivered its verdict. The second main scenario, the encounter, had been completed. Rewards would be calculated. They had crossed the tunnels, survived the illusory prison, faced their own worst nightmares, and met the survivor of the first shelter zone exactly as the scenario demanded. Kim Dokja had done it all through foresight and nerve, breaking a god statue to gain a skill he would need hours later, honoring a constellation so that its friendship would open a door down the road, and walking through a prison of pure trauma untouched because of a wall no one, not even himself, fully understood. He had reached Chungmuro, met a legendary ally, and cleared another impossible trial. But a great naval battle waited somewhere ahead, and the true protagonist had already gone before him into whatever storm was coming. The loneliest reader in the world followed the young naval commander up the stairs and into the next chapter of his journey. His story, as always, was only just beginning. Kim Dokja walked into a station where safety itself had been turned into a business. A place ruled by landlords who charged rent for the right to survive, backed by one of the 10 most evil beings in the entire world. And as he arrived, one of those landlords was about to teach a small, frightened boy a lesson in cruelty. This was Chungmuro, and here, everything had a price. The group descended into Chungmuro Station, following the young naval commander Jihai Li, and immediately the scale of things felt different. The system noted that multiple Dakibi channels were now live, because the scenario had grown large and sprawling, drawing more watchers and more streamers than ever before. It must be getting difficult, Dokja thought, for Baihyong to compete in a crowd like this. The apocalypse was becoming a bigger show, and the stakes were rising with the audience. They were not welcomed. Gangsters loitered near the entrance, and they mocked Jihai the moment she appeared, sneering at the teenage girl and calling her a little samurai for the blade she carried. It was a foolish insult. Because they had no idea who stood behind her. Jihai Li's supporting constellation was the god of naval warfare, the spirit of a legendary admiral who had once saved an entire nation upon the sea. The thugs who laughed at her would have swallowed their words in terror if they understood what they were truly looking at. They harassed the newcomers, leered at Sangha, offered her a room in a tone that made the offer sound like a threat, and warned them to learn how things worked around here if they valued their lives. Jihai, unbothered, simply told them she'd done her part and left the group to fend for themselves. "I'm off," she said, and walked on. "Would it hurt," someone muttered after her, "to be a little polite?" Kim Dokja had his own reason for coming here. "Is Yu Junghyuk here too?" he asked. Because the true protagonist had rushed to Chungmuro ahead of everyone, and Dokja needed to find him. When challenged, Dokja played the card he'd earned back on the collapsing bridge. "I'm Yu Junghyuk's companion," he said, "the one who returned alive. Tell him that, and he'll know exactly who I am." It was the truth, technically, and it bought him passage. But it also revealed something about the protagonist's presence here. The young survivors called Junghyuk their master. "Master isn't here right now," one of them said. Jihai herself had been saved by him, and now followed him. And here Kim Dokja learned an important, sobering truth about the hero he had read about for a decade. Yu Junghyuk had not saved Jaihai and these people because he was a good man. He had saved Jaihai because her constellation, the god of naval warfare, was an extraordinarily rare and valuable ally, essential for a great naval battle that loomed ahead. The others had simply been lucky enough to be standing near her at the time. The Regressor did not gather followers out of kindness. He told people to fend for themselves, and yet they were drawn to him anyway, pulled into his orbit by the sheer gravity of his overwhelming power. It was the cold truth of the protagonist: people followed him not because he loved them, but because standing near him was the safest place in a dying world. And Kim Dokja noted something else, something that mattered a great deal. Yu Junghyuk was straying from the path Dokja remembered. This third life of his was unfolding differently than the story had described. The reader's precious knowledge of the future was beginning to blur, and he needed to find out what the Regressor was doing differently this time. But the most important discovery in Chungmuro was the nature of the place itself. It was ruled by something called the Landlord Coalition. Kim Dokja knew them well from the pages of the story. They were exactly what their name suggested, landlords. Because in Chungmuro, the safe spaces had a special value. The system marked certain areas as green zones, pockets of safety where monsters could not follow, and the survivors here simply called them rooms. And the Landlord Coalition had seized control of nearly all of them, from the third basement level up to the first. They held a monopoly on safety itself, renting out survival to desperate people in exchange for coins, food, and labor. It was Inho Chion's cruelty scaled up into an entire feudal economy. Where Inho had been a single wolf hiding among sheep, this was an organized pack, a whole system of predators who had divided the safe world between them and stamped a price on every square foot of it. If you wanted a roof that monsters could not cross, you paid. If you wanted to sleep without being devoured, you paid. And if you could not pay, you were thrown back out into the dark to die, and someone else took your place in line. And their leader, the one who held all of Chungmuro in his grip, was no ordinary tyrant. He was one of the 10 evils, a member of the small circle of the most wicked and powerful beings in the entire world, a name that carried weight across the whole of the star stream. Kim Dokja had traded a station ruled by one manipulator for a station ruled by an organized empire of them. The people here lived under that empire's thumb. Jaihai hunted monsters and brought the meat to Yu Junghyuk to cook, and a whole cluster of survivors depended on that arrangement to eat. It was a fragile, desperate way to live, everyone reliant on the mercy of the strong. And the landlords enforced their rule with casual brutality. As Kim Dokja's group tried to make their way through, they came upon a crowd gathered around a commotion, and at its center was one of the coalition's landlords, a man named Pildagong, and he had found a target. It was Giliang. The gentle boy who spoke to insects had wandered, lost, into one of the green zones the landlords claimed as private property, simply looking for a bathroom. And Pildagong descended on him like a wolf on a lamb. The system flashed a cold notice: the boy had trespassed onto private property. "Who's this brat?" the landlord sneered. "You seem lost. Do you know where you are?" He toyed with the frightened child, mockingly asking where his parents were, pretending to teach him a lesson about respecting boundaries. "Didn't your parents ever tell you not to trespass?" he said, looming over the small, clueless boy. "So I'll teach you a valuable life lesson." And then he made the threat real. Pildagong activated his power, a stigma called Militarized Zone, and the area around Giliang bristled to life. Turrets materialized, weapons trained on the boy from every direction. The system spelled out the ultimatum. The landlord was demanding a payment of 500 coins for the crime of trespassing. And if the boy did not pay, every turret in the zone would open fire. "Hand over your coins, brat," the man said, extending his palm, while automated guns pointed at a lost child who had done nothing but look for a bathroom. It was the true face of Chungmuro, laid bare. A world where a grown man with power could corner a small boy, point weapons at him, and extort his life savings over an honest mistake, all with a smile and the backing of an entire coalition. This was what it meant to live under the 10 evils. Safety was a commodity. Kindness was weakness. And the strong preyed on the weak not in secret, but openly, proudly, as a matter of policy. The whole station had accepted it as the way things simply were. But the frightened boy was not alone in the world. Because Gilliang belonged to Kim Dokja's group now, and Kim Dokja was not the sort of man who watched a child get threatened and did nothing. He had walked into the belly of a monster to save people. He had toppled a tyrant to free the oppressed. He had held this very boy in his arms when the illusory prison broke his mind. And he was not about to let a smiling landlord and a ring of turrets have him. Everything Kim Dokja had learned in this brutal world, every coin, every skill, every hard lesson, had brought him to moments exactly like this one, where someone weak needed someone to stand between them and the cruelty of the strong. The landlord Pil de Gong did not yet understand what he had done. He thought he had cornered a helpless, clueless child with no one to protect him. He was about to discover, as Inho Cheon and Kyeol Subang and a demon lord's warden had all discovered before him, that the unremarkable man now approaching was the most dangerous person in the station. The loneliest reader in the world stepped toward the circle of turrets and the smiling extortionist, a constellation artifact of his hip and a decade of hard truth in his eyes. Chungmuro belonged to the landlords and the 10 evils. But that was about to be tested. And his story, as always, was only just beginning. A landlord had cornered a frightened boy, pointed a ring of turrets at his head, and demanded he pay for the crime of being lost. What that landlord did not know was that the unremarkable man now stepping into the circle had toppled tyrants far greater than him. Kim Dokja did not draw his sword. He did something far more dangerous. He offered a deal. Kim Dokja moved between the turrets and the trembling boy, and the mood in the station shifted. The landlord Pil de Gong, one of the 10 evils, the armament lord of Chungmuro, looked at the newcomer with lazy contempt. "I haven't seen you around here before," he said. "You've got quite the nerve." He was a man used to fear, used to watching people cower the moment his weapons appeared. And this stranger was not cowering. That, more than anything, made him curious. Dokja read the landlord's profile with a glance, and what he saw was formidable. Pil de Gong already possessed 2 personal attributes, and his mana was level 13, exactly what one would expect from a man who had earned a place among the 10 evils. This was no petty thug like the gangsters of Gumho. This was a genuine power, a villain of the story's upper ranks, and Kim Dokja knew better than to fight him head-on in the middle of his own fortress, surrounded by his own guns. So the reader chose the weapon he was best with. Not a blade. Words. "So," the landlord said, "what business do you have with me? You just here to pay? Should I make a deal with you, or just crush you right here and now?" The turrets hummed. And Kim Dokja, calm as still water, told him a lie wrapped around a truth. He asked for a room. He said he and his friends wanted to stay in the landlord's green zone, to rent safety like everyone else. "Please," he said, "let me and my friends stay in your green zone." It was the perfect bait, because it was exactly what a landlord expected to hear. But Pil de Gong's answer revealed the cruelty of the coalition's rule. "No," he said. We don't take tenants who aren't part of the Landlord coalition. Unless, of course, you want to pay us 500 coins each, daily. Greedy schmuck, Dokja thought. We can't afford that. But I can pay you in intel. Intel. The word made the Landlord pause. What intel? He asked. And Kim Dokja dropped the name that would change everything. Intel about Yu Junghyuk. The effect was immediate and electric. Pilde Gong's whole demeanor snapped taut. Yu Junghyuk, he said, his voice suddenly sharp. You mean that bastard who caused a ruckus a while back? You brat, how do you know him? Bullseye, Dokja thought. He had found the crack in the armor. Because the true protagonist had already torn through Chungmuro ahead of them, had already made himself the great enemy of the Landlord coalition, and the mere mention of his name set the armament lord on edge. But another realization settled over Kim Dokja, colder and more important. In the original story, at this exact point in time, Yu Junghyuk should have been locked in an all-out war against the Landlord coalition. That was how it was supposed to go. And yet here, now, that war had not happened the way Dokja remembered. The Regressor was doing something different. What the hell, Dokja wondered, could he be up to? The protagonist's third life was diverging further and further from the script, and every divergence made the reader's precious foreknowledge less reliable. He was navigating by a map that no longer quite matched the territory. How do you know Yu Junghyuk? The Landlord pressed, suspicious now. And Kim Dokja answered with a truth that carried real weight. He is a companion of mine, he said. We have been through life and death, on our own. A close friend of mine. Whether you believe me or not, he added, you've got nothing to lose, right? It was a gambler's line, and Pilde Gong took it exactly as intended. He decided the intel was worth hearing. All right, he said. I'll pay. But I'll only pay you in person. What? Dokja said. The Landlord's eyes narrowed with the greed that had earned him his place among the 10 evils. He wanted the information, and he wanted to control the exchange. And now the trap that Kim Dokja had laid began to close, though the Landlord could not see it yet. Pilde Gong activated a skill of his own, calculate profit, a power that let him weigh the value of any deal, and he decided the reader was probably the kind of man who would run off without paying his rent. From my experience, he sneered, people like you always run off without paying. Don't underestimate me, you brat. It was almost funny. The Landlord thought he was the predator here, sizing up his prey, calculating his profit. He had no idea that he himself was the mark, that every word Kim Dokja spoke was designed to lure him one step closer to a place where his turrets and his fortress could not save him. Well, if you say so, Dokja said. It's your loss. And then the reader began to walk away. It was the oldest trick in the book, and it worked perfectly. Where do you think you're going? The Landlord barked. You still need to pay me. He took the bait, Dokja thought. And gained the upper hand. Pilde Gong, the man who calculated profit, could not stand the thought of the intel walking out the door. His greed, the very thing that made him one of the 10 evils, had become the leash by which Kim Dokja led him. The tenant had become the hunter. The Landlord, the hunted. But greed is a dangerous thing to bait, and the Landlord's patience finally snapped. Damn it, he growled. It was about the money. How much was it? 100 coins. No, Dokja said coolly. 1,000 coins. For you and that kid. This bastard, Pilde Gong seethed. That's too expensive. Well, Dokja said with a faint smile, don't say I didn't warn you. And that was the spark. The armament lord, insulted, outmaneuvered, and enraged, abandoned all pretense of a deal. Die, he roared, and unleashed his full arsenal. The turret screamed to life and opened fire, a storm of shells tearing through the station toward Kim Dokja and the boy. "Dokja, run towards the crowd," someone shouted. The reader moved, dragging Gillian with him, weaving through the chaos as the landlord's weapons detonated around them. Crash! The blast tore through the green zone, smoke and fire swallowing the platform. For a moment it seemed the reader had been caught in the inferno. But Kim Dokja had planned for this too. He had a wall no weapon could breach and companions rushing to his side, and he had chosen this fight on his own terms, in a place and a moment where the landlord's rage would cost him more than it cost the reader. Because Kim Dokja was not alone anymore. Hyen Seong was there, and Sangha, and the others he had carried through poison fog and illusory prisons and murderous mobs. "Dokja," one of them cried through the smoke, "I don't think I can hold it much longer. Hui-1 is still passed out. Someone might end up dead if we start fighting right now." The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong move away from a bloodbath. And into that razor tension, Kim Dokja spoke the words that turned the whole confrontation on its head. "Mr. Gong, hold on," he said. "There is nothing to gain for us if we continue this fight. If you do," he warned, "you'll die right where you're sitting." It was an outrageous thing to say to one of the 10 evils in the heart of his own fortress. The landlord bristled. But Kim Dokja had one final card, and it was the strongest of all. "A close friend of mine," he said, "is making his way here." "That's the man who claimed to be a friend of yours," someone murmured. And the reader let the truth land with full force. "If there's nothing here for us to gain," he thought, "I should at least make them lose something." And the something he threatened them with was a name that made the entire landlord coalition tremble. "Hey, Junghyuk," Kim Dokja called out. And the system flashed a notice that changed the air itself. Yu Junghyuk had become agitated. Level 2 of Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint activated. Because the true protagonist had arrived. The Regressor who had waged war on the coalition, the swordsman whose name alone set the 10 evils on edge, stepped into the station, and Kim Dokja greeted him like the old comrade he claimed to be. "How are you?" Dokja said easily. "Looks like you've been doing good." Yu Junghyuk stared, and a single stunned thought crossed his mind. How did he get here already? The landlords panicked. The armament lord who had been so eager to crush a lone tenant now found himself facing the one man in Chungyuro he truly feared, summoned by the very stranger he had tried to kill. "Kill him, master," one of the henchmen screamed. But the balance of power had already shifted. Kim Dokja had walked into a fortress with nothing but words and a frightened boy, and by nerve and foreknowledge and the sheer audacity of his tongue, he had turned a landlord's greed into a weapon and a protagonist's fury into a shield. The loneliest reader in the world stood in the smoke beside the true hero of the story, having once again bent an impossible situation to his will. His story, as always, was only just beginning. The true protagonist had finally arrived, and the man who called himself his companion greeted him like an old friend. But Yu Junghyuk did not smile. Because in 3 lifetimes, the Regressor had never once acknowledged Kim Dokja as anything at all. And now the reader would have to prove, in the middle of an enemy fortress, exactly why the loneliest man in the world was worth keeping alive. "Wow," Kim Dokja said, grinning as the swordsman appeared through the smoke. "Good to see you. I'm so lucky to have such a great companion." Yu Junghyuk stared at him, unimpressed. Because the truth, as Dokja himself admitted, was far less flattering. Long story short, Junghyuk had never once acknowledged Dokja as his companion. The reader had simply managed to stay alive, again and again, in situations that should have killed him, and that alone had earned him a grudging place at the protagonist's side. When the landlords tensed, expecting the great swordsman to strike, Yu Junghyuk answered not with words but by silently pointing his blade at Pil Dagong. Companion my ass, Dokja thought wryly. But the message to the landlord was unmistakable. Pil Dagong didn't seem to want any bloodshed, not against this man, so he let the two of them go for the time being. The armament lord who had been so eager to kill a lone tenant suddenly found the arithmetic of the fight had changed. Did you want me to die? Dokja asked as they withdrew. I really didn't care that much, the swordsman replied flatly. It was pure Yu Junghyuk, cold and blunt as a drawn sword. But Kim Dokja did not take offense. Instead, he did what he always did. He read the man. He activated his power and pulled up Yu Junghyuk's character summary, and this time the system offered him the full version, a deeper look than he had ever managed before. And what he saw left him quietly stunned. Now I see, he thought, how extraordinary he really is. The Regressor's stats, his attributes, his skills, all of them had grown beyond what Dokja remembered from the pages of the novel. He may even be stronger, the reader realized, than he was during his third round in the story. He is as determined as I remember him to be. This third life was making Yu Junghyuk into something that outpaced even the legend Dokja had spent a decade reading. The protagonist noticed the intrusion. Damn, Dokja thought as the swordsman's glare cut toward him. He was reading me. What is he scheming, Junghyuk wondered, when it's only his third round? Because that was the mystery that gnawed at the Regressor. This ordinary-looking man knew things he should not know, appeared in places he should not reach, and carried himself as if he had read the ending of a story no one else had ever seen. And that unnerved even Yu Junghyuk. But he's starting to get on my nerves, the swordsman thought. Should I kill him? I'm joking. Even the constellations watching leaned in. The prisoner of the golden headband was disappointed in Dokja's antics one moment and delighted the next, and the whole exchange played out like two impossible men circling each other, each trying to read the mind of the other. Then Kim Dokja asked the question that mattered. He wanted to know why the Regressor was leaving Pil Dagong alone. In the story, Yu Junghyuk should have been at war with the entire Landlord coalition. Instead the swordsman had held back, and Dokja needed to understand why. Why are you leaving Pil Dagong alone? He pressed. Crazy bastard, Junghyuk muttered, but Dokja did not relent. He wanted to ask him something, needed to, because every divergence from the original story was a crack in the map he navigated by. And so the reader activated his own careful tool. Lie detection. He would know if the protagonist tried to deceive him. He's so damn meticulous, someone marveled, watching Dokja work an interrogation as precisely as another man might swing a sword. Yu Junghyuk's answer was simple and cold. He needed Pil Dagong alive. I know that you need him for a future scenario, he said, but you only need Pil Dagong, not his entire gang. The Regressor, too, was playing a longer game, keeping a member of the 10 evils breathing because that villain served some purpose further down the road. If you were a real prophet, the swordsman added with quiet contempt, you'd know. Prophets don't know everything, Dokja countered. And that was the heart of the tension between them. Yu Junghyuk assumed the reader saw the whole future. Kim Dokja knew better than anyone how quickly that future was slipping out of alignment, how this third life was carving new paths the novel had never described. Then came the moment the reader could not resist. I thought it was more your style to keep things simple, he said. Why are you letting them run rampant? And Yu Junghyuk gave the answer that summed up the entire gulf between them. I am a busy man, he said. You'll never understand. It was the loneliest sentence a hero could speak. 3 lifetimes of fighting, dying, and beginning again, all of it carried alone, none of it explicable to a man who had only read about it. How annoying, the swordsman thought. And yet Kim Dokja did understand, more than Yu Junghyuk could ever guess. Because the reader had wept over those 3 lifetimes on the other side of the page. He knew the weight the protagonist carried. He simply could not say so. The reunion nearly turned violent. "Can I punch you just this once?" Dokja asked, half joking, half serious, and the swordsman's patience finally frayed. "Do you really have the confidence to?" Jungheek said, and activated a skill, Tiger God Aura, level 5. The air itself seemed to bend around the Regressor's killing intent. "That bastard," Dokja thought, steadying himself. "Let's go." The two men stood on the edge of a clash that could have leveled the platform, the reader with his unbreakable blade and borrowed strength, the protagonist with the overwhelming power of 3 lifetimes. But it did not come to that. Because for all their friction, neither truly wanted to kill the other. Jungheek, that son of a bitch, Dokja thought, almost fondly, as the swordsman turned to leave, refusing to let Pilde Gong be dealt with the easy way. And here the constellations stirred. When Dokja spoke of the suffering the landlords inflicted, the bald leader of the peasants' army, the constellation of the great monk Samyang he had flattered before, was angered by the suffering of the common people and began calling for a people's revolution. The prisoner of the golden headband was pleased with the reader's defiance and gifted him 100 coins. Kim Dokja's every word, even his banter, was quietly earning him the favor and the wealth of the watching gods. Then the system delivered the reason the landlords could not simply be slaughtered. Kim Dokja had turned Huan's righteous fury on the coalition, and she had roared that she would go kick their asses, but the reader stopped her. "That won't work," he said. "I should get them better weapons." And when Huan activated her Judge of Evil power, her skill, Time of Judgment, it failed. "The skill has been cancelled," the system announced. Because the power of the Judge of Evil only worked when its target was genuinely, truly an evildoer. And though Pilde Gong and his gang were definitely evil from a human point of view, the constellations of the pure good alignment remained silent against Huan's judgment. "Why isn't it activating?" she demanded. "That's only from our perspective," Dokja explained. "The standards of morality that we humans abide by may be different from that of the constellations." It was a chilling truth. The gods did not judge evil the way people did, and the coalition, monstrous as it was, did not meet their cosmic definition of wickedness. So brute force was out. But there was a way. Kim Dokja studied the problem and found the answer in the landlord's own power. Pilde Gong's stigma, the militarized zone, was an optimal defense skill, but it only worked in the specific areas he had designated. His turrets would be useless if he left his area of effect. "We have to," Dokja said, "lure Pilde Gong out of his militarized zone. It would not be easy to draw the greedy landlord away from his fortress of guns. But it was the one path to victory, and the reader had already begun to see how it could be done, remembering how they had toppled the tyrant of Gumho Station together. "If we join forces," Huiwon said. "Remember Gumho Station?" An alliance was forming, hardened veterans of one uprising preparing for another. And then the clock ran out on their planning. The system flashed its final, fateful notice. The third main scenario had activated. Its name was Green Zone, Day 3. Its condition was brutally clear: occupy a green zone in the station and survive the monsters that emerged each night at midnight, for 7 long days. Well, a voice boomed over the platform, the Dakibi of Chungnuro grinning down at them all. "Let's begin the third day of the main scenario, shall we? I see some new faces here today, aren't you all excited?" Kim Dokja stood beside the reluctant protagonist, a plan half formed, an army half gathered, and a week-long siege about to begin. His story, as always, was only just beginning.